plan will now come to order, and it helps if I have a microphone. We will go around the board and have the members introduce themselves.
Frank Beal, Larson, Mary Shamberg, you're representing Northwest.
Carolyn Schofield, representing McHenry County.
Mayor Jerry Bennett, representing Southwest Cook.
Joe Zabo, CMAP staff.
Mayor John Noak, representing Will County.
Matt Brawley, the mayor of Montgomery, representing Kane and Kendall counties.
Rick Reinbold, Mayor Richardson Park, representing South Suburban Cook.
Matt Walsh representing West Cook County.
Good morning, board members.
Phone.
And on the phone we have, go ahead again, Rita.
Diane Williams, representing South Suburban Cook.
Rita Athis, City of Chicago.
Andrew Madigan, City of Chicago.
Thank you all. Again, we have a quorum, and before you first are minutes of our May 9th meeting. I'll entertain a motion to accept the minutes. Adjourned. I'm ready.
Short meeting today.
Moved and seconded. Any questions? If not, all in favor signify by a vote of aye.
Aye.
Opposed, vote of no. The motion carries.
Aye.
First item on the agenda is Joe's report.
So, Mr. Chairman, thank you. The update for the local technical assistance program is in your packets. Other announcements, like to announce that Jesse Elam has been named our new Deputy Executive Director for Policy and Programming. Happened just a couple of days after the last meeting, so actually he's been performing almost the past month. But Jesse is certainly not a new face to those of us here at CMAP. He was a director reporting to former Deputy Tom Katark in the past, and has been with CMAP and its predecessor, one of its predecessor agencies, NIPSI, since 2005. So we welcome Jesse to his new responsibilities.
Congratulations.
Just wanted to update you on the Spring Legislative Summit that we had the day after our board meeting last month. That was on May 10th, and I had several positive conversations with legislators and committee staffs. Always want to have more conversations, but at least those that we had were very meaningful. And I feel very good momentum on establishing CMAP as a resource for the legislature, as a source of creditable information and impartial policy analysis that can help inform their decision making. There's several follow-ups that have been asked for, and so that's really good news that we've been asked to perform several one-on-ones with legislators and committee staffs upon adjournment of the Illinois General Assembly. Also in the middle of May, I was out in D.C. with the Coalition for America's Gateway and Trade Corridors, was asked to present on a freight panel. Also while out there, met with members of the Illinois delegation and the staffs for House and Senate appropriations. Also was able to meet with U.S. DOT and White House staff on the administration's infrastructure proposal. And of course, my message was advocating for CMAP's federal priorities, as well as advocating for the 75th Street Infra Grant as the CREATE program. And staying with that subject, really great news last week to hear that we did in fact receive a significant grant for 75th Street, $132 million. It's huge news and really quite a success story if you think about it. This really is a case of everybody coming together in the region to make this happen. 3 years ago, there was no path forward. There was no path forward. There was no federal program that would fund improvements like this. There was no organization with the rail industry to make 75th Street a priority. Good work was being done on small CREATE projects, but not the big one. And, the old adage is success has many fathers, and that's really true in this case. It was the work of this agency, of the county board chairs coming together, many others in advocating for the freight provisions in the FAST Act to actually get a program put into place that 75th Street would qualify for. And of course, we got that done. And then it was getting everybody together, making the application and pulling together the state funding, the county funding. That was huge when President Preckwinkle stepped up with, I think ultimately was $78 million. I mean, that really closed the gap in getting the players to come to agreement on a sharing regime for the project. But this only gets us half of 75th, but it still has real deep meaning for the region. And of course, ultimately, when completed, means quite a bit to Will County for the ability to expand the metro service out there, as well as, of course, making sure that freight movement stays fluid.
If I can comment on that, certainly also for Southwest service, it's a huge,
yeah.
huge,
Yeah,
will make
yeah.
a huge improvement to a service that's been the stepchild of Metro for many, many years, along with the Heritage. And I know the mayors out Southwest, and on behalf of Will County even, need to get Metro's attention on making not only this SIP
Yeah.
project half a billion dollars, make it a reality, but more importantly, the construction aspect, which will complete the project, which is another $500 million. So the flyover aspects of this flyover is absolutely huge for freight too.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it is, it's the most significant freight project in the nation, but it is just all combined. So when I talk about the metro piece of it, it is more to put in context the regional benefits over and above the very clear freight benefits to the economy. And, while it doesn't get you that expanded service in the Southwest, it's a prerequisite, of something that has to be completed before that can even be contemplated. So it's big news.
Yeah, anybody ever interested in that, the complications of that 75th Street flyover? Metro's got a great little short video to show you the multiple crossovers that take place during that, or in that small section of both freight and Amtrak and the Southwest and Heritage Corridor lines going through there. An incredible web of congestion, so hopefully this will. Frank?
You're right about a lot of urging those influential in the
Yeah.
White House.
Yeah.
Not just
Yeah, no, Frank, you're absolutely right, and that's the kind of stuff that isn't, often seen. But it was those critical steps at the very end that I feel got this over the goal line for us.
Yeah. Which wrote the agreement.
Oh yeah, well, absolutely, IDOT and the governor. I mean, again, this is bipartisan across the board, and just so many players, so many players. We'll hear a little bit later on the agenda from FHWA and FTA on our certification review, and looking forward to that presentation by them. Certainly appreciate the praise that I've read in the document, as well as accepting the criticisms that are in the document of where we need to continue to improve. Particularly appreciate the praise for our hard work on the STPL reform, and the emphasis that they have in there that more work needs to continue to be done. Likewise, their praise for diversifying our funding regimes and implementing dues like essentially every other MPO across the nation. But their emphasis that they have to remain, a key part of our funding going forward. In addition, the 2018 municipal survey is now open and can be completed online at CMAP's website. There's also information available on postcards at the desk by the door. The survey closes on June 29th, so we ask that all municipalities please participate. And lastly, Mr. Chairman, my summer of visiting with all board members one-on-one to talk about the plan has begun in earnest. And so those appointments are scheduled, and I think 8 or 9 meetings have already taken place, but it's going to be a busy June as staff, opens up the public comment period officially this Friday on June 15th, be open through August 14th. We'll have our series of public forums across the region, one in every county, and a formal public hearing here. And so we do ask that you help spread the word on those to get good attendance and to continue to have feedback from all residents of the region, so the plan is there. plan. And that's my report, Mr. Chairman.
Any questions of the executive director in his report? Not moving on. Angela, you got a busy.
No,
you got a busy.
Tim and Bennett,
I'm
I
sorry.
just
Go
wanted to let
ahead.
you know it's Leanne Redden. I've joined by phone. It's Leanne Redden, and I'm joined by phone.
Oh, Leanne's on the phone?
Correct.
Okay,
Yes.
Leanne Redden on the phone. Very good. Thank you.
We caught your accent.
Just letting you know. Thanks.
Angela, you've got 9 contracts for consideration. Go ahead.
Right, so in the interest of time, I'm submitting for the board's approval, 9 contracts, a combination of contract approvals, 1-year amendment extensions. I believe I'm submitting 2 vendor limit increases and 1 intergovernmental agreement with the Chicago Housing Authority for the board's approval.
The board can see on their agenda, one's the pilot pavement data collection, regional transportation data archive, intergovernmental agreement with Chicago Housing Authority, crash data entry project, stormwater planning and engineering contract, Belmont Cragen commercial corridor plan, an increase in the budget for the onto 2050 photography and also on the printing services and an IT equipment backup system. Is there a motion for approval of all 9?
Approve all of those.
Moved
Second.
and seconded. Questions on any of those items? If not, all those in favor signify by a vote of aye.
Aye.
Opposed, vote of no. The motion
Aye.
carries. Thank you, Angela.
Thank you.
Caroline, you gonna give a report?
Yes, the planning committee met this morning, and we'll have some items today on the board agenda, so I'll go over it quickly. But first off, we heard about the upcoming LTA call for projects, and this year is actually being shifted to line with the ONTO 2050 plans. So they will be seeking applications for new plans and studies that can help implement the plan at the local level, and those dates are September 6th to October 26th. That will be the call for projects. Next, we talked about the draft ONTO 2050 plan and changes that had been implemented based on committee, board, and this spring. And that plan will be coming up for public comment on the 15th, so this Friday. The committee discussed the initial external implementation efforts for ONTO 2050. And finally, we saw a presentation for the website plan for the ONTO 2050 plan, which was similar to what the board saw last month.
Very good. Any questions on the report? Thank you. Moving on. Angela, you're back up on the UWP program?
Oh, we got programming too.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Mayor, go ahead.
That's all right. So programming committee met this morning. We also talked about ONTO 2050 and the launch for that. Encouraged everybody at that meeting to attend that. We talked about the 2019 Unified Work Program that the board will approve later today. The committee formally recommended approval of that and the pilot pavement management program, which we just approved. Talked again about LTA and the open and call for projects on September 6th. And then we got a presentation on the North Lawndale Neighborhood Plan. It's a draft plan right now. Cook County Commissioner Dennis Deere was at the meeting and really spoke in great detail about the coordination between that plan and the North Lawndale Community Coordinating Council. So I would encourage you to check that out, and that I think they're looking to roll that program out or that plan out later on this summer. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. Any questions of that committee report? Again, moving on, Angela?
And if we can add Member Oberman to the roll.
Chair will recognize his attendance. No problem.
Quick overview, just to recap some of the items I talked about last month as it relates to the comprehensive FY19 budget. Also, in addition to that is the FY19 UWP budget. The comprehensive budget in total reflects total revenues of about $18.4 million, which is down 12% from the prior fiscal year, with total expenditures of 18.3%, down 11% from FY18. Things to note in the budget, the FY19 budget, is that there was personnel expenses where we added 2.5 positions were added to the budget. We added an accountant, a principal in research and analysis, and a licensed engineer. There was a 9% increase in commodities and a 112% increase under operating expenses, primarily related to the launch of ONTO 2050. We had 6% increase under occupancy expenses, and those are related to the things under our lease. rents, real estate taxes, and common area expenses and utilities. Our comprehensive grant will be funded this year by Federal Highway, Federal Transit Administration, IDOT, for our local match, the Illinois Environmental Protection Agency, the Cook County CDBG grants, Chicago Community Trust, and local dues. For the UWP component of the budget, this year approved in March by the UWP, April by the Transportation Committee, and this morning by the Programming Committee, a total budget of $22.4 million, which reflects about $21 million in core programming and $1.5 in competitive projects for all the agencies. Competitive projects were awarded to CMAP and RTA, TDOT, CTA, and METRA, and this was an increase from the previous fiscal year of $357,000. This was made possible by CMAP shifting $783,000 of its operating costs from the UWP funding to the local dues. We have state budgets, so it's our and we anticipate receiving our state match, and therefore local dues will remain at its FY17 and 18 levels of $887,000. That's being reflected in the appendix of our budget. The budget also reflects a 5% increase for the operating budgets of CDOT, CTA, Metro PACE, and a 6% increase for Council of Mayors for the additional scope required under the STP reform. So today I'm asking approval for item 7.0, which is the 19 Unified Work Program, and approval of item 8, the 19 Budget and Work Plan.
Firstly, under item 8, under the program, any questions regarding that? If not, all those in favor signify by vote. I'm sorry, is there a motion to approve that?
Yes,
Seconded. Any questions? If not, all in favor signify by vote of aye.
Aye.
Opposed, vote of no, the motion
Aye.
carries.
Thank you.
Who's ever in the background there on the phone, you need to quiet your office. We're picking up background on you. Thank you.
Or put it on mute unless you intend to speak, please.
Next item is 8.0 is the budget and work plan, which obviously an extensive amount of work has gone into that. We reviewed it at the prior meeting.
After one of them, he's waiting for me. Come on, you're cold. So let's go direct to the second one. All right.
Can we please have those on the phone mute?
We're picking up background.
Yeah,
I'm working on it.
We're picking up a lot
I
of
know, I hear you.
background
I'm working
noise.
on it.
Please mute.
I'm muted.
Okay.
Thank you.
Under item 8.0, which is the budget and the actual work plan, any comments or questions regarding that presentation? If not, I'll entertain a motion that we approve the fiscal 2019 budget.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Any questions? If not, all in favor signify by a vote of aye.
Aye.
Opposed, a vote of no, and the motion carries. And again, to staff, thank you, Angela, for all the work that's gone into that and the details that are involved in supporting the documentation. It's quite a. If you don't have anything else to do at night, you can go back and review that as we move along in the year. Under item 9, Jesse, under the pilot pavement management program.
Good morning, thank you, Chairman. This is actually an item that goes along with the procurement for the payment services earlier on a 2050 graph. Pavement management, particularly about how frontier for that.
Hey, Jesse, your microphone's off.
Shall I start over?
No.
Anyway, the frontier for pavement management, asset management in general is really local governments based on where we are in this region. So the pilot program that you have before you today that I'm asking for your approval on is really meant to help municipalities develop pavement management plans that emphasize lowest cost solutions for maintaining a given pavement condition level. This pavement management pilot program is also tied in with the surface transportation program reforms that I've spoken to the board about on several occasions previously. Given how much of our surface transportation program, the STP local, goes towards improving pavement condition, it really makes sense, we think, to encourage municipalities to think about how to stretch those dollars just as far as they possibly can. So back in January, CMAP opened a call for projects in which we solicited interest from local agencies, particularly municipalities. And when we closed that in March, we had gotten 69 applications, which I think demonstrates a lot of interest and need for this. So let me quickly explain the selection process. The first cut for this 69 applicants was geography, because we want to try to help this take off everywhere in the region. So the idea was that we would target at least one plan within each council of mayors. Then, because the idea is to encourage wider use of pavement management systems, we wanted to encourage or preferentially fund the development of new plans over updating older plans. And then, because the cost of doing one of these plans really depends on the size of the community, really the length of the roadway network, there really aren't too many ways to put all these factors together and stay within our budget. So the list of communities that you have in your memo really represents those puzzle pieces all fitting together. So in terms of what the participating communities are getting, the plans are going to be doing a complete inventory of pavement condition on the whole local street network. They will then provide several budget scenarios, in other words, what you get in terms of pavement condition for a given level of investment. And then finally lay out a recommended capital program. And the work will be done by one of the 3 engineering firms in the procurement that you approved earlier. And of course, these are community plans that are to be implemented. And so we are really looking to make sure that the participating communities are absolutely in the driving seat for what they want in their plans and what kinds of pavement treatments they're willing to consider. So I'm looking for your approval this morning to go ahead with these planning efforts in these communities. The programming committee did recommend this morning. Next steps from here are to develop memoranda of understanding with the communities and then get started with the intent to wrap up these planning processes by next summer.
Just a couple of comments I'd like to make. First of all, I was absolutely in awe and impressed of 69 communities applying for that grant. Number one, I guess maybe I assume that some communities, we've been doing this for a long time, that everybody was on track and doing that locally, but to see 69 communities, and that, again, I'm impressed too of how you try to spread that out, because if you went through the sheet, that is really done nicely throughout the entire region as to who you chose and who you didn't. But third, most importantly, is that what this agency, again, can provide to local government on a really, down to the nitty-gritty type of work that people don't think about, but is so important in the process of planning. So a great job with this. And I'm sure for many communities who have never done this before, it'll be an eye-opener as how they can go forward in spreading their dollars and either, doing complete resurfacing or in the patching various seal coating and stuff like that. So it was a good job. Comments?
Question, Jesse, it was mentioned, I believe, of a grant to the state.
Right.
My question is, if we're successful in there, is there a guesstimate?
I was trying to look for it.
Well, we think that budget, if I recall correctly, is based on us being able to do all of the new plans that were recommended or that came in through our call for projects. So there were some communities that just wanted to update their existing plans. But I think the 40-something of them were completely new plans, and so the idea was that we would at least be able to fund all of those through this through the state grant.
Did I understand that there was pending an application?
Yes, there's a pending application, yeah.
Possibly expand the number of communities?
That's correct, yeah.
What would be is there a guesstimate on percentage-wise, how we might be able to proceed?
So our intent was to go back to the call for projects that brought us 69 applicants. We're only, with the money we have in hand, we can only fund 12 of them. We think we can get into the 40s, get all the new plans. Yeah.
Oh, great.
Yeah. That was what the budget was based on.
And the timeline for this, was that asked?
July, I think it's July.
So the timeline for the state grant, if it comes in, will be.
No, I'm sorry, completion of the review of all these requests. Take a year to do that?
Yeah, we would like to get all the plans done basically by next summer. We think that's reasonable given 3 contracts.
And the reason I ask is, again, this will also be impetus to
Right.
to going to the state of Illinois about motor fuel tax and the need for funds for local roads.
Right.
You now have a document in hand, along with those who already have that information, to make your case as far as where we're going with the future funding.
I think that won't hurt.
So, yeah, one question I had on that. Do we know if 69 of our communities applied for this? I'm assuming and I'm hoping that many of them, if not all of them, already have a plan or did have a plan. Do we have any idea of how many of our communities don't have any pavement management plan?
We are actually tracking that through our municipal survey.
Okay.
And so at least half of them do not have any kind. And this is based on our 2016 results. Some of them that said that they did have a system for pavement management. When you dig into the details a little bit more, they're not emphasizing pavement preservation. They're frequently doing worse first. Like the street with the most potholes is the one that gets the pavement. It's not necessarily an asset management approach. So we think there's a fair amount of opportunity out there on the local community front.
Okay. Thank you.
And Mayor, at the very least, for those who have never done this, at least an awareness of if they didn't make the cut, of what they need to do. I mean, it's so critical, and you would think that's a automatic assumption that most towns have that, and believe it or not, they don't. I don't know how they wing their motor fuel tax every year with the worst potholes or a road closed to step that up. But from a long-term planning and your program, that's what really is important.
Yeah, I was just going to say that it's an excellent way to approach asset management. The engineering firms that we're using, my only question is, are we going to give then the communities a full range of options, including some of the newer emerging technologies for patching and for,
Yes.
I just want to make sure we're kind of looking at the entire gamut, because there are a lot of newer types of approaches that not everybody's using yet. So I just want to.
Yeah, the crack sealing, for
there's
example,
a
has been
wide range of
we've been using
crack
that now for
sealing
the last
approaches.
5-6 years, and it's really extended the use of.
But even in materials, I mean, there's a wide range today. So
That's right. I mean, we want to make recommendations that communities can and will implement. So there's that, but we also want to be innovative and make sure that we're using the newest engineering and the stuff that we think is going to get us to the lowest cost, for the pavement condition that we're getting out of it. So absolutely, we're going to be encouraging them to recommend new treatments and really explore that.
In fact, I brought that up about 2 or 3 years ago about IDOT on the selection of new products in the marketplace. They're very difficult to work with. From what I hear, they reject 90% of some of the new techniques out there, and I don't know who has control over that. But there are some products that are being used in other states that are really supposed to be cost efficient. And I know IDOT wants to be strict about how roads are repaired and or paved, but I'm just wondering if that'll ever change going forward. Further questions? Do we have a motion?
so
And a second? And seconded. Any further questions? If not, all in favor, signify by a vote of aye.
Aye.
Will oppose, vote of no. Motion carried. Just thanks. It's a great plan.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, moving on to appointing a nominating committee to make recommendations for the next group that will lead the agency. And I am asking that Marty, you serve on the committee along with Mayor Welper, Diane Williams, to meet and make recommendations for the board, chairman, vice chair, executive committee, correct? Always. So I'll. I'm making an appointment. I don't think I need a board approval of that. But thank you for volunteering to serve on that, and your recommendations will come back in September to this full board for final approval. Moving on to the item 11, U.S. DOT Planning Certification Review. John Donovan. John, welcome.
Thank you. We have
And Tony? Yes.
Good morning. I am John Donovan with the Federal Highway Administration, with Ms. Tony Green, Federal Transit Administration. We're going to walk through real quick an overview of the review we conducted of the Chicago Transportation Management Agency. Tony will review the findings. But first, why do we do this? The easy answer is, well, we have to. Federal law requires us to come in. Now it's every 4 years to give a review of the metropolitan planning process in regions over 200,000 persons. This is the 7th such review that's been conducted in the Chicago region since first one in 1996. So obviously there's been a lot of changes in the NPO environment since then. There's been a lot of changes in this region. As you might suspect, a lot of those early reviews focus a little bit more on regulatory compliance as the process has continued to evolve. I think all the partners legitimately feel kind of more of that second bullet. We're using this as an opportunity to try to refine, enhance, and improve the planning processes. Again, within federal law, there's 10 emphasis areas here, and there's numbers and numbers of regulations. We used to have a slide in here with various regulations, and then we needed 2 slides and 3 slides. So we got away from that. Just talk about all the various emphasis points that are in federal law now for NPOs to respond to. And I like to look at this list and say we kind of want it all. And that's kind of an expectation in transportation. We want to move people, we want to move the economy, we want to protect the environment, and do it in a safe and efficient way, in an equitable way. A lot of interests that sometimes even compete with each other. So with all these emphasis areas, we take a look at these reviews in a risk-based fashion. We try to mold the review process to what's going on in a particular region. We assess progress on previous recommendations and findings from previous reviews. We try to understand what's affecting this region. It is obviously unique from the other, I think there's about 400 MPOs in the nation. Unique set of circumstances anywhere you go. This is a mature planning process. It's a complex planning process. A lot of resources are devoted to this planning process. A lot of great work being done. And again, this review, we're able to focus quite a bit on assessing the response to new requirements. Through MAP 21 and through the FAST Act, there's been considerable emphasis on moving towards a performance-based planning and programming approach, a lot of new freight requirements, and on and on. We're pretty good about adding on requirements. So again, looking at a risk-based process, we looked at 6 broad areas. The first being the structure and the administration of the NPO itself. So when we talk about that, we obviously look at the roles and responsibilities of all of the different players in the NPO. The policy committee, the governing body of the NPO, transportation committee, it's its primary subcommittee. But again, Council of Mayors is kind of a unique entity and unique beast in this region that provides a great opportunity for the planning process to move to the local level. Again, you know, throughout my time with Federal Highways, we had a lot of questions about how does a Council of Mayors operate? Because again, it's a relatively unique attempt to bring a regional process down to the local level. The CMAP committees, the CMAP board, how CMAP as the entity interacts with NPO and is integrated is obviously another strong consideration in this process. And again, the CMAP staff that serves as staff of the NPO. We look at boundaries, whereas the CMAP boundaries are defined by state legislature. The NPO boundaries tend to change. They'll be changing again with the 2020 census. As we look forward, we can expect the NPO boundaries to continue to expand. What does that mean in relation to the work that CMAP does? What does that mean in relation to the other competing interests throughout the region? There's a lot of agreements. We take a look at kind of the requirements there and making sure those are being satisfied. The self-certification process that the NPO addresses on an annual basis, and not the Unified Work Program, which kind of defines how the NPO will spend the planning funds that it receives. Skip one there. Performance-based planning and programming. Again, like I mentioned, MAP 21 and the FAST Act moves the federally required planning process to a new approach. I say new approach, but again, these concepts are not new here. Looking back to the original passage of Go to 2040 with the Regional Indicators Project. A lot of emphasis on trying to quantify and trying to understand what the investment of resources gets. And again, there's a lot been discussion here, there's been a lot of discussion nationally. But while these are great philosophies to discuss, it's tough to do in practice. It's not an easy process to apply. Here, the federally required process that's been put in place, targets are being set, the agreements now are in place, and again, all the federal requirements and steps, we'll be working with, again, the staff and the committees and such to move that forward. But how are we going to actually utilize this information to make better decisions in the future? We look at the Metropolitan Transportation Plan, which is kind of the backbone of the regional planning process. Again, in this review, the plan that's on the books is the Go to 2040 update. We actually didn't spend a whole lot of time on reviewing that. Again, I think our ongoing work, we've had plenty of discussions. A lot more emphasis looking at onto 2050, how we're going to continue to improve things moving forward. Obviously, we looked at the focus areas, the resilience, inclusive growth, prioritized investment, and fiscal constraint. You can't talk to a Fed, talk about transportation planning without a significant discussion on fiscal constraint. And what we like to emphasize, although we spend an inordinate amount of time on talking about assumptions and talking about how the technicalities of a fiscal constraint will work, it's important to remember that that's an exercise that's designed to be a tool to establish a budget. The budget requires the region to establish priorities, and that's what the planning process is in a nutshell. We don't have unlimited resources. We have a gazillion competing interests, but how are we going to bring all that to the table and make decisions to utilize the resources that we have? And obviously, as part of the process, we also look at the regionally significant projects, which help define where the region's going. A little bit outside of the traditional federal role, but we also took a good look at the Expressway Vision Study. I think just the timing of that effort is unique and very complementary to the work going into Onto 2050. Whereas there are federal requirements about what has to go into the required plan, the Expressway Vision Study is kind of operating outside of that and in a lot of good ways. Allows the region to look and consider bigger picture issues. And again, I think that work going on simultaneously with the Onto 2050 work has been a real plus. Likewise, the Revenue Subcommittee work, again, excellent example of moving forward, trying to take these planning concepts to the next level and decide how we're actually going to move forward and address some of these fiscal challenges. We talk about program development, kind of where the rubber's meeting the road is what the highways guy would say. I'm not sure what the transit guy would say, but again, this is moving, again, all that good planning work that we do to actually getting projects done out in the real world. The Transportation Improvement Program, occasionally you have air quality amendments here, other things that pass through here. Again, this isn't the sexiest part of the planning process. I'll be very, admit that. But again, a very crucial and critical part to actually getting the projects done out there in the world, getting improvements made. Same could be said about the air quality planning aspects. And again, we talk about the regionally led programming efforts here, whether it's the 5307 funds. Again, a lot of emphasis, obviously, this last certification cycle in the STP program. But again, these are opportunities to essentially for the region to put the money where their mouth is. Again, we've talked about all these great concepts about performance-based planning, about emphasis, about our priorities, and again, I think there's a lot of examples where this region is doing an excellent job of, again, trying to put their money where we talk about our emphasis should be at the planning process. Again, also can't talk to a Fed in this type of review without bringing up public participation, civil rights. Again, these are the concepts that individuals and groups and organizations have to have an opportunity to be meaningfully engaged in decisions that will affect them. Again, there should be fairness in investments to meet the needs of all community members. Again, a lot of federal requirements in terms of how this is addressed in the planning process, both from public participation plan and all the products of the planning process to specific federal legislation addressing civil rights. So we take a strong look at those. And again, this time around, we conducted what we consider a freight program assessment. Again, an emerging area in federal legislation. Again, not obviously a new concept area here. But again, the FAST Act did include a lot of new provisions, a multimodal freight network, strategic plans, advisory committees, state freight plans, on and on and on. And regionally and locally here, there's a lot of work being done. Again, at the state level, the state freight plan and the recently announced competitive freight program, the regional strategic direction that was produced by CMAP. Again, at county level, a lot of the counties are doing specific freight planning efforts. It's not to mention other efforts at municipal and some of the other counties' work. Even federal highways, we jumped into it. We conducted a mega regions event here last fall, and specifically focused around the freight concepts. So a lot of interest in those issues, a lot of, like I said, emerging legislation in those issues, a lot of work being done here. With that, I will turn it over to Tony, and he'll talk about the findings of the review.
Thanks, John. Hello, everyone. So what we did in our report is we talked about we outlined the requirements, the legislation that we're looking to fulfill. We discussed how the region addresses the requirements, and then we made recommendations or accommodations depending on the situation. So what I'll do is I'll just kind of briefly walk through. The report has a lot more detail on some of these. So a lot of good work, as everyone has been saying here, and we tried to make sure that that was addressed in the plan through the accommodations. So such as the IDOT functional classifications, it was critical work that CMAP was involved in here. Onto 2050 development that everyone has been tirelessly working toward. We thought that was a lot of good work done toward that in a lot of different areas. The ETIP implementation, that was a big effort by staff to move the TIP onto the electronic platform, which we thought was very insightful going forward as we're looking at performance-based planning and we're looking toward better data and analysis. That was pretty critical to make that leap, and we thought it was a tough effort, but well worth it. The STP MOA, a lot of work done toward that. It was a long-standing federal recommendation to reform the STP program, and great critical first steps. Continue with that, and we thought that was worth championing. The IDOT support of the STP reform, not only in leadership, but also in terms of financial support, we thought was very important to highlight. Obviously with CMAP right there at the table, working closely hand in hand with them. CMAC, TAP, performance-based planning, moving the review and evaluation of all the dollars that go out of the agency to performance-based planning is very important, as each legislation that comes out over the last decade has moved more and more toward that and tying dollars more towards performance-based planning. CMAC committee moved toward that approach it's been a little while now since they've been doing that. But we thought that was a great approach that they used and continue to refine. So we call that out as a accommodation. Public engagement, not only for 2050, which we thought has been great, but a lot of earnest and practical engagement of the communities. It's very difficult to engage the public in some of these complicated, complex issues. But I think CMAP, we believe CMAP does an excellent job in trying and using the resources that they have. A lot of great work called out in the plan, in our report for that. Inclusive growth, it's something that is one of the priorities for 2050. It's also been a priority at the agency for a while, since 2040. And we thought that continued emphasis was very critical and important. So we wanted to make sure that got some kudos. Safety, a lot of use of data and collection of data and sharing of data towards safety measurements and performance targets across all modes, and we think that is very important. Obviously, it's a big requirement, but CMAP and the agency and that work with CMAP have been at the forefront of pushing toward incorporating safety more and more. And then IDOT CMAP critical urban freight corridors coordination. It's challenging work, but the cooperation between two agencies we thought was worth praising. So we also had recommendations. Our recommendations are just things that we see that we want to encourage to continue going forward. Things that we think that maybe could be added. So some of these things are happening, but we want to emphasize them a little bit. So we continue to the agency continues to work on clarifying the unique roles of the MPO and the CMAP board. It's sometimes hard to explain in an elevator speech to folks. And I think the website has certainly done a lot toward improving how that message is delivered. But we think there's always room for improvement. Over-reliance on state match, I think we've talked about that here. Many within the agency, within the CMAP have understand that and are taking strong steps toward addressing that. So again, it's a recommendation to continue the work that's already being done. Council of Mayors Planning Liaison Program, we have some recommendations about how to better utilize that program. Consideration of MPO expansion with census coming up in 2020. And again, some of these are just concepts that we think should be looked at. Engagement in the transit asset management plan. I think the agency has been pretty engaged in that, but there's room to further work with the transit partners in that area, especially early on. Round Lake Beach, McHenry, Grays Lake agreement, that's something that's just a step away from being signed. It's one of those things that needs to be in place, and we know it's going to be in place. But until the final signature's on there, it's something we have to incorporate. But we know that agreement has more or less been finalized. Carryover agreement and endorsements are also recommendations that we think that can be improved upon, as well with cost effectiveness of CMAP. 5307 transit funding transparency, working with RTA on that. I think some of these are issues that, again, CMAP would like to improve, and our approach is that we're supporting those ongoing efforts. Engagement in transit capital programs, early engagement, so that CMAP and their data and their expertise are brought in at early stages to make sure, and I think that's one of those things that's going to be critical as we do performance-based targeting and planning. That can't have plans dropped on your desk when they're finalized. If we're looking at tying this to the TIP and performance to our programs, then everyone needs to be engaged pretty early on. The CMP update. That I think congestion management plan. There's a lot of congestion management discussion and data sharing happening within the region. The CMP just is a formal document to kind of show the work that's already happening. Performance reporting, emerging technology, and coordination of freight planning. Again, all details kind of detailed further within our report. Hopefully this list isn't, these are the recommendations in it, again, in the plan. We wanted to give a full reading of them here, but they are, again, just recommendations to improve the work that's happening, and sometimes championing the work that's already moving forward. So we're available for any questions that from the board or otherwise. And here's our contact information if you want to follow up with us.
Any questions? Mayor, go ahead.
Question on the recommendation, is there a document that details further depth of the bullet points?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Yes.
we've
So
got a full report.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, the report has a lot more information. Just didn't want to get too far in the weeds here, but certainly that'll go around and be shared with the board.
And staff's already been in the process of digesting it, and again, looking how we continue to improve. It's, for us, always about continuous improvement. We certainly are recognized as one of the high-performing MPOs in the nation, and for us, it's always about getting better, and so we take their recommendations very, very seriously.
Thank you.
Frank?
Yeah, looks like
Mr. Chairman, if I can just jump in, I just wanted to share with the committee that, or the board, that RTA has received the same report too, because obviously a lot of it references us, and we continue to work with staff on all those issues as well.
All right, Leanne, we got it.
Thank you.
Frank, you need your microphone on.
5307, transparency, that word is strange.
So 5307 transit funding, the way the process that the region goes through to divide those funds up between the transit boards is it comes to this committee to the MPO, and I think it's fairly transparent at this stage. It's just earlier stages that we see an opportunity to improve. How do we arrive at some of these splits? What's the data that we're using? Again, in an era where we're trying to justify through data how we arrive at divisions within limited funding, showing our work, so to speak, is, we think, critical.
It's quite a technical report, which is required, as we all know, as part of our operation here. Gentlemen, thank you both for your presentation. Jenny, good seeing you again. And if there's no further questions, move on to Carolyn. You got another report.
Yes, as the board may recall, several months ago, the CMAP Board and MPO Policy Committee convened and appointed a subcommittee on transportation revenue, and since then we've met 3 times, and the report that we have concluded with is actually in your packet today, but I'll just go over some highlights. First, the transportation revenue forecast and recommendations of reasonably expected revenues for onto 2050. The financial plan for transportation is what this subcommittee was then tasked with looking at further, kind of getting more into the weeds and not doing it so much at the board level, and then reporting back to these committees. So we looked at the near-term implementations and those recommendations, which I'll cover in just a little bit. But first, as I mentioned, the technical report, final recommendations, which were requested by the CMAP Board and MPO Policy Committee chairs, is within your report. So in there, outlined in the memorandum included in your packet, we did discuss the following recommendations for onto 2050. Because the onto 2050 financial forecast estimates that expenditures for operating and maintaining the transportation system to its current state of repair, it will exceed revenues from existing sources by $24 billion. New revenues will be recommended in this plan. The revenues must be used to leverage and supplement existing sources of revenue. And the subcommittee had arrived at a consensus over these sources and to be recommended into the onto 2050 plan. And those are to increase the state motor fuel tax and replace with a vehicle miles travel fee, which would be approximately $31 billion. Expand the sales tax base to additional services for an $11 billion. implement a regional revenue source at $7 billion, adopt a federal cost of freight services fee at $5 billion, expand parking pricing at the local levels at $2 billion. We also discussed transportation funding implementation priorities, which would then supplement some of those recommendations and get more into details, and reach consensus on 5 essential components for any new transportation revenues that may be proposed. And those principles include that they're able to sustain the transportation system, sufficient to improve the system both now and in the future, benefit-based, so that it generates revenues from those who will derive benefit from the system, considers the ability to pay, invested via performance-based approaches, and that it would support all modes of transportation: roads, transit, freight, bicycles, and pedestrian. The subcommittee also identified 3 near-term priorities for revenue implementation. So we took those that I mentioned earlier that were priorities and what we wanted to focus on in the near term, and provided revenues to the state, local governments, and transit agencies to continue to maintain and improve the system for the near term. And those were recommended at a 15-cent increase to the state motor fuel tax and future transition to a vehicle miles traveled fee. And then adding a 4-cent regional motor fuel tax, which would also transition to the VMT. And then finally expanding the sales base to additional consumer services, which would bolster RTA sales tax revenues. So these were the ones that the committee had agreed, 1 would have the biggest impact, 2 would be most sensible to implement, I think because of that derived from that user-based, and then would just produce the most amount, so should be in the near-term focus.
Questions regarding that report? I think the VMT continues to be a political cloud as to future funding, and for as much as we continue to put that into recommendations going forward, the reality of short-term versus a long-term, it's going to be a challenge, and that's going to start with. We'll have to start with members of the General Assembly, and I mean they're still fighting over whether or not to do a motor fuel tax increase, let alone a complete changeover in how taxation takes place on drivers. It's the last session, Marty. Again, it was brought up under a capital plan, and some of the committee reports I saw, I mean, they are so far away from endorsing or even getting into a position of possibly studying it more, recommending it. No, I don't see that.
The key here is making.
I've not seen a commitment. No.
No, and the key here is making some incremental progress on this. It's not like this needs to happen tomorrow, but we do have to make a fundamental shift to a user fee base. It's a matter of fairness. It's a matter of the crisis that we're facing. The cliff is very real. And, motor fuel tax is a outdated way and unsustainable way moving forward of funding transportation. And so making sure that it's user fee based, is simply a matter of fairness as well as arithmetic. I think I mentioned our legislative open house in Springfield last week. And I believe last month I talked about my testimony before the House Transportation Committee. And I think at least we're starting to have some conversations that, help players, or the decision makers, I should say, understand that there are ways to allow an opting in and opting out, that there are ways to work through some of the equity issues to make sure that it truly is done in a fair manner. And that there's going to need to be a movement towards a pilot project that, rather than try and take the political bite, a very difficult political bite of doing something statewide, it probably makes sense to move into it a little bit more slowly so there's a better comfort level that the public is ultimately able to understand how it does best serve them. And so those are the types of conversations that we're continuing to have.
Well, I think you're absolutely right, Joe, that given, Illinois politics, the incremental approach is probably the only politically realistic way. If past is prologue, while the rest of the country is moving in this modernized direction, we'll be way behind. And then eventually we'll do it because it's the only way to do it, so it would be good. And I think CMAP's a good place to be putting some of the impetus behind it to get it moving, but I think you're right. You can't just jump in whole hog. I mean, nobody will buy it because they won't understand it.
And I just wanted to add that, I want to echo what Joe has said during that, the subcommittee meetings, this was a concern, that this is a new tax, it's changing, we're adding, and I just think that the education piece is so critical, and that this is not necessarily a new tax, it's going to user, based, I mean, especially onto 2050 and incorporating technology and what that's doing to vehicles, I mean, it's an absolute necessity. So it's just a different way of looking at things. It's not necessarily an increase. It's just a new way of looking at it that has to be done in order to keep up with technology.
But we have a bad political history here. Every time, 25 years, people have said, let's replace the school funding property tax with an income tax. Public says, no, you're gonna keep them both. And that's the kind of fight you're gonna face here too. We're trying to replace the motor fuel tax and convince people we mean it.
Yeah, and certainly we go into this with open eyes, what the political realities are and the challenges. But, we feel that it's very important that our role is to inform the debate, to continue to do our good policy analysis, and make sure that decision makers have good information as they make these decisions. And we have to make sure, as this conversation continues, that we do a much better job. And this is the hard part. But we have to do a much better job of putting it in terms of what this means to the individual citizen and why it's important to them and why it best serves them. And, ensuring things like the performance-based programming, to me, is going to be critically important, right? People want to make sure that if they, agree to a new approach, that they're actually going to get the value that they've been promised. And so it isn't just a matter of raising revenues. It's raising revenues with the appropriate reforms that make sure that we're prioritizing investments and that the pennies are going into those projects that absolutely provide the best return and public benefits.
One other point, a mistake made in the past too was on motor fuel tax, although that has been increased since the 90s. It was never tying it to inflation, which would have been an immediate offset or at least limiting the crisis that we're in today.
Absolutely.
Because that never took place. And if they do it without a VMT, then they better consider some type of built-in inflation into a...
Or that, takes those things into consideration.
Thank you, Caroline, for that.
One other question I had on that.
Yes, ma'am.
The regional MFT, in addition to the state MFT, what's the vision as to how that would get implemented?
Mayor,
regionally meaning...
Mayor Emanuel spoke for our Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus Group last month, and we talked about where we're going as a region. And because, again, politically, of the division that takes place in the state by people pushing metro versus non-metro. In fact, there was some guy who was going to introduce a bill to separate Chicago from the rest of the state recently.
Every few years.
So it's the way I look at it, Mayor, is that for our region, yes, at some point in time, we need to take care of our own, and I think that's going to have to be placed upon our own representatives in our region as potentially some type of additional revenue that would stay regionally, and not necessarily that we can't count on anybody else. But one thing I'm concerned about is that is not measured against what the state may do, saying, well, you already have enough revenue. If we pass a new taxation, you're going to be excluded, or we get into this formula-based stuff, which ends up being, what it is today. 45 us and 55 or 60. Downstate.
So the idea is that the region would be like the CMAP region. Wouldn't be sub-regions in there that would be expected to. Okay.
So the conversation's at a very high level at this moment in time, but the need is very clear for a couple of reasons. One, you take a look at those regions that have been successful in their economic growth. Denver is a great example. They have implemented regional taxes that have allowed them to fully fund and bring to a state of good repair, modernize their transportation network, and it has fed their economic growth. You compound that with, the emerging federal policy now of where, the proposal is for the feds not to be the partner that they've been in the past with a 80% federal obligation and a 20% local match. And, while we may not see that full shift from 80-20 to 20-80, like was in the infrastructure proposal from the White House, there's little doubt in my mind we're going to see a shift. And even in things like the infra grant, it was our ability as a region to leverage those local, state, and private dollars that made us attractive on the infra grant. So going forward on things like build and infra and other federal programs, you're going to have a heavy match from the state, local, and region to be successful. So self-help is going to be the a key part of this.
Other comments or questions on that item? Carolyn, again, thank you. All right, on to item 13 on to 2050. Liz, you're going to be first up.
Oh, it's on the button. Okay. Good morning, everyone. I am today going to broadly present the recommendations of the On2 2050 plan. We anticipate it going out for draft this Friday, June 15th, and being available for public comment through August 14th. I have a number of slides, and I know time is going along, but luckily many of you addressed some of the key topics that the plan covers and illustrated their importance already earlier today. I want to talk first about how we got here. We are today at the bright green bar at the end, about to launch into our last phase of public engagement and conversation about the plan for adoption in October. But this really builds on 3 years of work and 3 years of effort from all of you and all of your staff and contributions in terms of feedback, participation in committees, participation in resource groups and task forces that really did help shape the recommendations of the plan. Throughout the process, we endeavored to ensure that we included the public at every step of the way, and we did this through many different options. We had kiosks that we deployed throughout the region where residents could come up and take a survey, as well as learn about the topics of the plan. We held forums for partners and the public to discuss major issues that affect us today and in 2050. We held 277 workshops, both with the general public as well as with municipal staff and elected officials, again trying to address needs of residents throughout the region. And then finally, at those meetings, we had 4,750 residents. Joe set us a very high target for public engagement this time around and asked us to double the Go to 2040 engagement, and we have more than done that already. Since we are CMAP, all of the recommendations of the plan are also founded on a significant amount of research. So we produce 9 snapshots where we look at trends in the region for things like demographics, condition of the transportation system and our economy, and 23 strategy papers where we developed the recommendations of the plan. In some cases, we refined Go to 2040 recommendations that were broad and provided local direction on things such as reinvest in existing areas. In other cases, we expanded to new topics for CMAP, and you see that in some of our inclusive growth work, for example. The recommendations of the plan really build on the condition of the region today and the major changes we see happening here and coming down the pipeline nationally and globally. So I want to take a minute before I talk about the recommendations to really cover those elements. First of all, the region is growing economically, and we have many economic assets to build on. But when we take a look at our peers, we're growing more slowly. We are the bright blue line on the bottom of this chart, and it compares the growth in our gross regional product from 2005 to today. And so you see us growing, but we're not growing quite as quickly as peers. On this chart, you see Boston, Los Angeles, New York, and DC. Similarly, we're growing in terms of employment. We have more jobs today than we've had since 2000, and there are many opportunities that the region is taking advantage of, but our growth in employment and other similar economic measures is not quite keeping up with our peers or the rest of the country. When we look at population growth, the picture is a little bit darker. We have seen very small population declines in recent years, and those were followed by small increases. And the result is we've got 7 or 8 years of essentially flat population in the region. And so we're not attracting and retaining new residents at the rate that we used to or at our peers, or that our peers used to. In developing the plan, we've taken a lot of looks at what could help the region be more economically successful, what could help us to attract and retain more residents, more businesses. And this is a complicated chart, so I'm going to walk you through it. You have 4 triangles, for lack of a better word, showing economic outcomes by race of residents for Chicago, Boston, New York, and Los Angeles. And there are 2 big takeaways from this. Number one, when we look at economic outcomes by race across our region, across Chicago and its peers, and we actually looked at this for 10 peers, you see inequitable outcomes. But when you look at the Chicago region, you see outcomes that are much worse than our peers. On this chart, in all of the regions, the green line is Black residents, and the item on the upper left that you see, the green line in Chicago reaching for is unemployment rate. So we see substantively higher unemployment for Black residents in the Chicago region as compared to our peers. We've looked at a number of different measures such as commute times. You see similar kind of negative factors occurring for Black and minority residents in the region. When we look at our peers that are more economically successful, that have longer periods of growth and more economic growth overall, what we see is that they do a better job of providing economic opportunity for all of our residents. And so the plan includes a number of recommendations there. The plan also has to address demographic change. One thing that we see here, nationally and globally, is that people are living longer. So you have 2 charts here, population by age group in 2015 and in 2050, with the oldest residents at the top, youngest at the bottom. And we anticipate that by 2050, residents over the age of 65 will increase by 80%, and residents over the age of 75 will more than double. And this is going to change the type of communities that we build and services that we need to provide. We're seeing a changing preference as well for where people and businesses want to locate. This is a snapshot of one of the go-to onto 2050 indicators. It actually was a go-to 2040 indicator as well, is where development is landing in the region. On the left, you see development that has occurred in areas that are suitable for infill, areas that have population, employment, and infrastructure already, residential and non-residential development from 2000 to 2015. On the right, you see those same numbers for what's under construction today. And you see a substantive shift of housing and some non-residential development to infill supportive areas, areas with transit access. And so the plan has a number of recommendations to address changing market dynamics, particularly those that seem to be changing on a large scale. One thing I want to note, not all of this development is happening in the city of Chicago. It's a question that comes up often. We're seeing this pattern throughout the region and throughout our communities. And then finally, the plan has to address the constrained revenue situation that we have in the region and in the state. This shows transportation costs and revenues. This dynamic is something that we see across many of our areas of work, not just transportation revenues. But what you see here is operating costs are that for the transportation system are the red line kind of at the top of the chart, and the various revenues available for transportation are the blue lines at the bottom of the chart. So you see costs rising while revenues are remaining flat or slightly declining depending on the source. So to take advantage of some of these opportunities and address these challenges, the plan has 3 principles. The first is inclusive growth, building on the idea that in order to grow the economy, we need to increase opportunity for everyone. The resilience principle builds on the idea, builds on all of the changes that I just talked about and even those that we don't know about. In order for the region to thrive in the face of that change and take advantage of opportunities, we need to build infrastructure and systems that can adapt to change. And finally, when we have limited resources, we need to target them to maximize the benefits. The On to 2050 plan has a series of goals. I'm going to spend the rest of the presentation walking through those goals across its 5 chapters. I'm going to address each at a very high level. There's a lot of detail behind these. I'm happy to answer questions if you have more detailed questions. The first chapter is community, and this is where you'll find many recommendations about local development and economic development. I talked a little bit earlier about changing development dynamics. This is another slice of that. You see, since 1995, the proportion of permitted housing units in the region that are single family in blue and that are multifamily in orange. And you see, back in the 90s and early 2000s, we were primarily building single family homes. And now we are shifting to a somewhat equal mix of multifamily and single family. And again, I want to emphasize this is a change we're seeing throughout the region in our suburban areas, not just in the city of Chicago. So the chapter has a number of goals and recommendations to address these kind of changing market dynamics. The first goal of the community chapter is just strategic and sustainable development, and it is an embodiment of the prioritized investment principle. When we have limited resources, we need to be careful about investing in new development, about investing in expansion of the region, new infrastructure, preservation of natural areas, etc. So recommendations here focus on targeted investment and how to do that well, and potential creation of a targeted reinvestment area program, as well as focusing our reinvestment efforts in disinvested areas. Reinvestment for vibrant communities builds on and expands one of GO-TO 2040's major recommendations to reinvest in existing areas and provides new direction and more specific direction for many of our local governments on developing walkable communities and great places, on promoting housing choice, and on incorporating green infrastructure and natural features into redevelopment. And the final goal in community is development that supports local and regional economic strength. State tax policy can create differing decisions in terms of municipalities being able to ensure that they have the fiscal resources they need, as opposed to making choices that might have broader regional economic benefits. And so there are a number of recommendations here. Number one, to improve the way that we plan for market and fiscal feasibility, to improve collaboration on economic development at the local level, and to change our tax policies to give municipalities more and better revenue options. The next chapter is prosperity, and I do want to take a moment to step back and say the entire plan is a plan for prosperity, and that's something that we talk about often. But the prosperity chapter does cover several topics very directly related to the region's economy. This chart on the screen shows one of the major issues that this chapter and the plan has to take on, which is the changing nature of work. You see a trend that's happening throughout the U.S. as well as in the region, which is a shift to new jobs occurring both at the high and low end of skill levels that are required, and a decrease in jobs that are middle skill. And this is important because middle skill jobs offer residents an opportunity to enter the economy and often offer a stronger opportunity for upward economic mobility. The prosperity chapter has 2 goals. The first is robust economic growth that reduces inequality, and there are a number of recommendations within this. First and foremost, regional economic collaboration, which we've already seen great strides on through the county's collaboration and creation of CRGC, as well as recommendations to improve our connections to the global economy by focusing on traded clusters, and improve opportunities for upward economic mobility for all of our residents, as well as economic innovation. Responsive strategic workforce and economic developments really builds on and expands a couple of core elements of GO-TO 2040. That plan had a major focus on human capital and highlighted the idea that workforce, or a well-trained workforce, is a major asset when businesses are choosing where to locate or where to stay. And the region today has one of the best educated workforces in the country. It remains an asset for us. So there are recommendations to continue that and improve our workforce planning, as well as better target the economic development resources and economic incentives that we have. The environment chapter is a new standalone For On to 2050, if you were around for Go to 2040, recommendations for environment were really strongly linked to land use. And now we've elevated them to their own set of recommendations and strategies. The map here shows preservation of open space in the region from 2000 to 15, as well as highlighting in red open space that was developed. The red area is about equal to the size of the city of Chicago, and at the same time we preserved about 61,500 acres of open space. That actually was substantial progress on our regional goals, but we think we can do more. And one reason I show this map is because open space preservation has broad benefits, not just for environmental recommendations, but for many of our land use recommendations and recommendations around ensuring that development is fiscally feasible over the long term. There are 3 goals in the environment chapter. The first is a region prepared for climate change. And so it expands upon recommendations in Go to 2040 that CMAP has since advanced about climate mitigation, as well as adding new strategies to promote climate resilience for the region, some relevant to improving the transportation network, others relevant to better planning for flooding and stormwater, with a particular focus on engaging vulnerable populations and planning for them in this work. The next goal is an integrated approach to water resources. And this highlights the need to better plan for water in the region and do so holistically. So there are recommendations about water supply, water quality, and planning for stormwater as well. And thinking about these as a system can have many benefits, improving our data, integrating planning for water into many of our other planning processes can help move the region forward. And the final goal here is development practices that protect natural resources. Recommendations here are twofold for improving development when we expand the region, ensuring that that development is environmentally and fiscally and economically sustainable, as well as better incorporating green infrastructure and natural features, environmental justice issues, and similar in redevelopment. The next chapter is governance. And this map here highlights an issue that we see not just for municipalities, but overall, which is revenues and fiscal resources. It shows revenue per capita for each municipality in the region. Those in the green are within 20% of the median. And one highlight here is those in orange that are at least 20% below the median. These are often small municipalities in terms of population and staff and have many needs that can be addressed by the recommendations of the plan. The first goal in governance is collaboration at all levels of government. And we believe this is critically important when we have limited resources and when we're struggling economically to really help the region move forward and continue to thrive. We highlight the need for collaboration on the region's economy, on inclusive growth, and on transportation infrastructure. But we also mean collaboration here at the local government scale. So you'll see recommendations on shared services and consolidation. The next goal is capacity to provide a strong quality of life. When we talk about capacity, we talk about the ability of our local governments to meet their goals and to help implement their plans. Capacity can be something as simple as having the right knowledge, the right software, the right equipment. It might mean needing more staff or different staff or increased collaboration with neighbors to do the job better. It also reaches as far as the revenues that communities have. So recommendations here are for CMAP and others to help build local government capacity, as well as to address tax policy to change the revenues that communities have. And then the final goal here is data-driven and transparent investment decisions. Building on the idea that when we have limited resources, we need to do so in a way that is performance-based. And we also need to work with the private sector and others to improve the data that we have or get the data that we need to really do so. And finally, the mobility chapter. The map on the screen shows the fiscally constrained, regionally significant projects. I'll go through those in a little bit more detail. But the mobility chapter has many other recommendations to essentially help us to build a safe and reliable system for tomorrow. I think when we talk about transportation, we can really get focused on the gaps in the system today. But one of the things that we saw in plan development is that we are at a time of change in terms of the way that technology enables us to get around and in the way that people want to get around. So there are a set of recommendations and goals to meet future needs as well. The first goal here is a modern and multimodal system that adapts to changing travel demand. And recommendations within it address helping the region to continue to be the nexus of freight for North America and supporting that as an economic asset. Also helping to make the transit system more competitive as technology changes and as the way people move changes. And then finally, recommendations here highlight strategies to use new technology that we already see today, such as data and communications technology that's enabling services like Uber and Lyft, as well as proposing strategies to address potentially transformative technology like autonomous vehicles. The next goal is a system that works better for everyone, and there are 3 areas of recommendations here. The first is inclusive growth and leveraging the transportation system to promote inclusive growth, particularly focusing on commutes. The second is improving safety for all users, whether that's auto, bikes and pedestrians, or transit riders. And the third is preparing the system for climate resilience. The final goal in the mobility chapter is making transformative investments, and this is where the regionally significant projects are found, but this is also where our recommendations about planning, about the financial plan and revenues for the transportation system, as well as performance-based programming, asset management, and many of the topics that you talked about already earlier today are found. So I'm not going to belabor these, but just to say that the investment that we see, the investment that we want in the region through 2050 requires action on revenues and improved approaches to managing the transportation system. The first map, this map shows the transit regionally significant projects. In blue, you see the rail projects, and in red, you see the bus projects. Evaluation of bus projects is new for On2 2050. It's something that we took up when we expanded the criteria, or expanded the set of projects that we evaluated to truly assess all projects with the potential for regional impact. And so you see things like the PACE arterial rapid transit network, one highlight on the far left, that kind of straight up and down red line. We also see an emphasis on reconstructing the existing rail system through projects such as the red purple modernization. The next set of projects in the plan is the highway and arterial network projects. As with the transit side, arterial is new for On2 2050 as compared to Go to 2040. The arterial network is very critical for moving people and goods on a day-to-day basis. And so you see a series of projects that help trucks get around, that help people get around, and that also in many ways support transit. On the expressway network, the emphasis really is rebuilding the system that we have. Much of the expressway network is 40 to 50 years old and simply needs to be rebuilt. At this time, we are pursuing expansion where it makes sense, such as along some parts of I-80 or realignment of old bridges. Again, I-80 is an example here with the bridges near Joliet. The plan has a focus on implementation, both near and long term. Drew is going to talk about that later today, so I am not going to go in depth. But I do want to emphasize that we're already reaching out to all of you and even more partners to figure out how to move the plan forward right away. We have a series of public open houses. There is a handout up front where you can grab more information about each of them. The dates are highlighted in blue on this screen. We also have a formal public hearing on the 25th at CMAP. The open houses overall are structured to be a drop-in format. We encourage you and your residents to attend. You don't have to attend the whole meeting. We'll have staff there to walk through, answer questions, and collect feedback. And finally, you saw a presentation last time around highlighting the idea that the plan is going to be on the web this time. We believe that this reflects the way that people obtain information today, and so the structure and design of it is really put together to be accessible and informative. I do want to emphasize we have an example of the final full design up here today. There will actually be a simplified version of the website available for public comment with all of the interactives and bells and whistles available in the October version. So I know I covered a lot of information very quickly, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
Well, we're down to the nitty-gritty with this, and I think it was important that you especially this overview of what the plan will entail, certainly from the public comment period. Any questions from the board members on some of the things presented? Liz, thanks. Mandy, on the launch event?
Morning. I just wanted to, although many of you have already heard my event spiel this morning, I just wanted to make sure that everyone knows that the On to 2050 launch event will take place October 10th, 2018, following the board meeting that day. And we will be in Millennium Park for that event, so we will be in touch about details, logistical details in terms of setting up the prior meetings and the board meetings such that we can all be there at 10 o'clock and get there on time. It is a come one, come all event, so I would encourage you to just share this information with your colleagues and neighbors and anyone else that you think ought to be there that day. I want to just talk a little bit about the program, as Liz mentioned, and I think as Drew is going to talk a little bit more about. We're really moving into implementation mode at this point, and the event really will put a focus on putting the plan into action. We'll of course want to make sure everyone in the room is familiar with all of the principles of the plan, and we'll have that time and to kind of do that big overview. But we really will focus on how we're going to get this done as a region, and so there'll be a keynote from Clarence Anthony, who is the executive director of the National League of Cities, and works with regions, I should say, all around the country on really charting the course for their future. And I think that's a strong message that he'll bring, and the principles of the plan are also something that really align with their agenda. So I think he'll be a great inspirational kickoff for the event. And then a panel of voices from across the region will discuss how their work already is and will continue to be a part of making this plan happen. One last thing, if you haven't received any postcards, there are some additional ones by the door, and I would encourage you to take them back to your office, share them with folks, and there was a link in the board packets for registration. If you haven't registered already, please do, and please feel free to share that with everyone that you know. Thanks very much.
Mandy, what's the count at on registrations? I think it was pushing 400 last time I asked.
We're in the mid 300s at this point,
okay.
actually, but so we do have room for more. And but this far out, I think it's a pretty comfortable number. But we will be doing a lot more promotion over the summer. We want to kind of get through the public comment period and make sure people know about those opportunities as well. And then we'll really start to heavily promote the event going into the late fall or late summer, early fall.
Great. Any questions on that? Thanks, Mandy.
Thank you.
Drew?
Sure. Want to briefly go over some of the near-term implementation projects that are underway, in that they are primarily being scoped at this point. And so essentially the projects I'm going to talk a little bit about are those that require external partnerships, and in order to seamlessly transition from plan development into plan implementation, we want to make sure that those partnerships are queued up as much as possible before the plan is adopted so that we can get rolling on them immediately. So as I said, these are all projects that would require external partnerships. They are relatively near-term in nature, and we are looking forward to input and questions from the board and other committees periodically over the next several months on any of these. So feel free to make comments today, ask questions, or follow up as you would prefer in the off time. So I'm going to go very quickly through each of these. I want to emphasize it's a living document. There are additions that will be made over the next several months, notably some water supply efforts that are already sort of at the scoping stage as well, and I want to make sure that we touch on those in the coming months. So look forward to more. So as organized by the different sections of the plan, the first one is developing a targeted reinvestment area program. And so as all of you are aware, staff have done considerable analysis identifying areas that should be prioritized for investment based on that they are either mixed use, they're economically disconnected areas, or their employment centers. And we're right now at the very early stages, as promised, in engaging a wide variety of partners and stakeholders in developing the scope for that effort, considering what it might look like, but wanted the board to be aware that those conversations are beginning at this point. Under the governance section, establish regional coordination on inclusive growth. With a series of near-term champions, we're pursuing an exploration of what that might look like on a regional basis. And at this stage, really, we're solidifying those champions. We're trying to see what a coalition effort would look like, trying to establish some goals and some performance measures to be able to track implementation of those goals. And so that is on a very much on an exploratory nature. It'll take place over the next 4 months. If it's successful, then it'll move forward in a more lengthy basis. After that, we have evaluate options to incorporate capacity building into CMAP programs as well as partner activities. That's further along in terms of scoping, and the board has heard us discuss what capacity building would look like. There was a strategy report on that. And so at this point, we believe that it will follow into sort of one or more of 3 tracks, sort of deep embedding of staff at local governments that are low in capacity, enhanced training efforts, building upon the trainings that staff have provided in the past, and then also exploring service sharing where folks are interested in that, or coordinated investment where folks are interested in that. And so we've had some near-term optimistic feelers out for fundraising to supplement UWP funding in those efforts, and we're feeling very confident in those efforts at this point. But again, that effort is sort of starting at this point. Lastly, explore options for expanding and coordinating primary health data collection. This sort of responds to a concern that in several of the public health surveys that we use to describe public health outcomes around the region, certain populations are undersampled, and there's a way to deal with that, but it will require coordinated efforts by different departments of public health. And so we've reached out to several of those departments at this point, have had some near-term interest in pursuing that together, and we'll continue to sort of go down that path and see what can come of it. In terms of regional prosperity, the first is forming, funding CRGC, and having CRGC host co-host a forum with the Chicago Fed. Done, and done. So that's one thing that we can sort of claim success over. And this board obviously was hugely important in getting that done. And then the next 2 components under there reflect some analysis. The first discussing looking at the traded clusters and how inclusive growth and a series of other strategies recommended in the plan would relate to those traded clusters and enhance them potentially. And then lastly, you may have noticed the labor market polarization policy update series that was published relatively recently, which will eventually sort of morph into a state of jobs in the economy report in mid-2019. Next, under environment, determine interest and seek funding for developing in the next iteration of the green infrastructure vision. The board is surely familiar with the GIV at this point. We want to sort of get it to its next stage. There are some developments in data availability there that would help us to make that a more authentic map, and also to sort of deal with some of the corridors in that map that are, at this point, mostly placeholders, but the new data would allow us to make that better. And so conversations have started with the Chicago Wilderness and other partners to get that effort going. Looking at a new regional climate resilience partnership to focus on strategies in ONTO 2050. So far, this involves sort of reinvigorating the resource group that helped to develop that strategy report, and there will be a series of conversations over the summer to see if that's a thing and if that group can become something more than it has been so far. Then lastly, under environment, explore the potential to create updated municipal emissions profiles in conjunction with a partner. This is conversations I've already started with a partner that would need to develop those emissions profiles. The goal here would be eventually to include those in the community data snapshots that many local governments around the region refer to, and we'd like to incorporate those into that, but that remains to be seen if that will be possible. So we're starting that conversation now. And so finally, with the mobility section, support new transportation revenues, research, and initiatives. There has been discussion on that today. There will be, and so I don't want to really dig too deeply into that, but that conversation is well underway, and we want to, as a staff, support that in moving forward. Forming a private provider committee or task force as part of CMAP's working group structure. This sort of reflects sort of the varying level of engagement and membership on different committees of private transportation providers in the past, and wanting to make sure that we do the best that we can to engage that cross-section of folks in our work as an agency. And so those conversations are starting now with various private providers to see who would be interested in such an initiative, and we'll return to the board and the committees with how that evolves in the future. Continuing to work with IDOT and FHWA to allow the use of transportation development credits to serve as local match. We've initiated those conversations so far with both IDOT and FHWA. There's been some dialogue. We understand that it's more complicated than a simple imaginary money falling from the sky. And so we want to make sure that those continue so that we can continue to go down that path, but we want to do it in the best way possible. And so that will likely be a protracted conversation at this point. And so the next is work with IDOT to revise the design manuals for a variety of reasons. We want to make sure that again continues in conjunction with IDOT. There have been some initial conversations. I think there's a lot that we'd like to see in there, and I think that revising the manual is a very technical exercise. So again, this will likely be a continued and protracted discussion with an eventual goal of getting the design manual updated. And then finally, conduct a series of truck routing, permitting, and delivery management studies in the region's freight-intensive land use clusters. This would build upon the Franklin Park-oriented multi-jurisdictional freight study that has been done in the past and has already had some wins associated with implementation. So there are 3 different groups of municipalities now that we're exploring 3 different studies with, and we hope to make those a reality in the near future. So with that, I will stop, and I'm happy to entertain any questions or comments, and we'll make sure to refer as needed.
Any questions, comments?
Mr. Chairman, I have a question.
Sure, go ahead.
So actually, Drew, it's really more of a comment, not really a question, I guess.
Sure.
I would just hesitate, the comment about creating a separate committee for the private providers. I guess I would be sort of reluctant to get behind that. I think we should try to work to incorporate them into existing conversations, existing work that's happening at regular committees and other committees that are already well established talking about that. I just don't a real value in creating a whole sort of separate group for discussing some of those issues.
Thanks for that. That's helpful. And Mark made the same comment at TC last week.
Okay, great.
Thank you, Drew.
Thank you.
Gordon, you're last up.
Good morning. I'm going to let the report speak for itself. The General Assembly concluded their business on time. They passed a $38.5 billion spending plan, which included the funding within IDOT's budget that we've always depended upon. There's not really too much to report about what they've done. The thing that I will share with you as far as staff's activities, we will continue to monitor the process as the governor takes action on the bills that have passed the General Assembly. We're also going to be reaching out to members of the General Assembly to invite them to the open houses that will be taking place throughout the summer, and inviting them also to the launch event in October. We will continue to have, develop some of the conversations that we began when we had our open house in Springfield. A lot of it revolves around the VMT discussion, and so we will continue to work with both the House Transportation Chair and Minority Spokesperson. But with that, that kind of concludes my comments, and if you have, remarks, I'd be happy to respond.
Comments? Other than to say, for as much as we put this plan together in 2050 going forward, and we talk about governance, we talk about collaboration, especially in government, there still continues to be, I believe, a disconnect with local government and state government. The bubble down there, sometimes we think it's even bigger than what it should be. The disconnect between the whole operation of needs of revenues at a local level versus obviously their concerns and problems that they have at the state level. I don't know what it's going to take. I'm not saying they're all like that, but they really do need to be brought into the fold. And part of the disconnect, I think, again, and I don't do this to say it's a regional battle, but I really think outside the metro areas or outside the areas where good planning and understanding of certainly of what we're trying to do up here in the metro area is not understood. And because we don't have then that support of the General Assembly from people outside the metro area, this becomes, again, a fight and frustration, a political battle over revenues and where we're going, altogether. So it still continues to be my frustration, I know, from many, many mayors. And the actions that take place every year continue to be somewhat disappointing in not understanding the importance of that collaboration of state officials. We represent the same people with local government officials. They just don't, whether it's more mandates, or whether it's continued takeaway of even home rule powers that has taken place over the last, especially the last couple of years, is really becoming discerning. And again, What we need to do, I don't know, but it's just frustrating. I'm off my soapbox, good. Any other
Thank you.
comments or questions?
Yeah, yeah.
Frank?
I had a question about the freight mobility where you're recommending neutrality. Can't that be amended or?
So so we spoke with the sponsors, we spoke with IDOT, the technical staff, and there was, basically we agreed to disagree about, the direction that they were trying to go. And so our concern deals with, there is a portion of the language that we believe requires local municipalities to build, for instance, a subdivision intersection to the same standards of, some major intersection. IDOT believes that there is language in there, it's permissive, that they could sign that particular intersection or that particular intersection and build it to the same standards that they currently build them at. We just think that's kind of crazy. They could have just changed the language, but they were unwilling to do that. So
IDOT was unwilling.
yes.
Any other comments, questions? Gordon, thank you.
Thank you.
The board is going to have to go into executive session to discuss some contractual obligations. And before I do that, the meeting is open to the public. Any comments? Oh,
Shut down.
I was going to mention that.
Okay. Sorry.
Good morning, Chairman, Board of Directors. My biggest concern is the park forest, because every time when me and my wife go to different events, they don't have no addresses for the park forest, like the forest preserve, like the one in Rolling Meadows. They don't have no addresses, and like in Lake County and DuPage County, they have addresses, but some in Cook County doesn't have no addresses. And whenever we try to call the paratransit for our reservations for the forest preserve, they said it's not in the system.
Yeah.
And I think we need to make sure to get an address to put in the paratransit system, so whenever there's different walk events coming up soon, so people won't be able to know where is it at, and they have a hard time getting to it. So if DuPage and Lake County can have addresses, why not some of them in Cook County can have addresses? It's long overdue to get addresses. So I think we need to get that issue on having addresses at the forest preserves, because this is a must, because this is the 21st century, and if other counties can do it, why not Cook County? Because there's no excuses to get addresses in there for the forest preserve, because me and my wife will have another one coming up September the 23rd in Rolling Meadows, and then when I call them up again, there's no address in the system, and I think it's time now.
So is it only in Cook? You have no problem in any other county? To your
I think
knowledge,
one of them in Rolling Meadows, and I don't know the others area, because sometimes in Elk Grove too, they don't even give out no addresses, like when we have different walk or run events, because other counties, like in, my wife checked it out, she says in Lake County they have an address for Forest Preserve, and in DuPage, but I don't know if some of them in Cook County have addresses or not, because that's why we need more addresses to put in there, so when I call paratransit, they'll make sure to have it in the system for Forest Preserve, because it's really getting us frustrated to know that they don't put no addresses in the Forest Preserve, because it's time now to put addresses in there.
You would think a simple solution, but
Yeah,
we'll
we'll
follow up
follow
with
up on
the
it.
county chairs, yeah. Thanks. Again, ladies and gentlemen, the board's need to vote to go in exec session, discuss some contractual concerns, legal concerns. I'll entertain a motion that we go into exec session. July 2nd. Before you go, we will not meet in July and August. Praise the Lord. We'll see you in September.